Okay, we're going to talk about event-driven programming, and the classic beginning of the concept of event-driven program is old school event loop. Here, your program might have been menu-driven, and you sat and you waited for a user to type in a menu selection, like number 3 would take you to the accounts receivable section of your program. This particular type of programming tended to be fairly modal. Because the amount of input that was allowed was limited, you would put a user into a specific mode. For example, customer records would take you to that particular screen with another submenu that you could select from. Uh, there was no OS help. The operating systems tended to be single user or very limited in their functionality and tended not to provide you any sort of uh, events to your program. You had to build those event loops yourself. What happened was the types of inputs began to get much more extensive as we began to adopt things like mouse and GUI systems, network interactivity, and allowing communication between applications. So your event loops that you had to write yourself became extensive. And so what happened was there was kind of a shift in paradigm to an event-driven model. And as a result, the programs basically became less modal. You began to talk about writing your program from a perspective of making it reactive. In other words, it sat and it watched for different types of events to occur, and then it did the stuff that was appropriate for that particular event. And along with this came a better user experience because users, the way you interact with the world is generally on sort of an object event type thing. Uh, um, and so what happened then is as this paradigm shift began to occur, the OSs and the development frameworks that we use to write applications began to provide a fairly extensive um, set of events that could be consumed by your application. And as a result, we ended up with a fairly sophisticated programming environment that you could write applications that could consume a subset of a very wide variety of choices. So what are events and event handlers? Event-driven program is built around these two concepts. Events are the messages. This is the hey, I'm over here, or the doorbell rings, or somebody flashes a light at you. These are events. And then there are responses that are triggered, um, and the responses are known as handlers. These are the actions that take place when that event is triggered. An example would be here we have a young man at the door, may ring the doorbell, and the response would be to go and answer the door. So the ding is the doorbell ring event. We would say that the doorbell ring event fires. Fires is the creation of the event in response to the actual stimulus, in this case, the pushing of the doorbell. And that doorbell ring event gets placed onto a into a queue basically, and then all of the different applications running in the OS get a view into that list of events that are waiting to be processed. And here, the on doorbell ring code would be the handler that's been associated with the doorbell ring event. And the association between that particular code and that particular event is known as wiring up. We wire up the doorbell ring event to be handled by the on doorbell ring handler. So if we're going to create these, in our particular case, in a C#.NET application, like a Windows Forms application or a Web Forms application, or any of the variety of the variations of those in the .NET environment. In C#, we would have properties associated with any sort of visual item. So let's say we have a button on a Windows form. We would have a page. If you click the little lightning bolt icon, you will get a list of the available events for that object. You can then wire up a specific event. So in the case of a button click, we might want to handle the click event. That's the most likely thing you're going to do to a button. And we then create a event handler. So I would type in the name on doorbell ring. And as soon as I do that, the the code, the .NET environment, will create for me the event handler properly formatted and attached to the click event. So now whenever somebody clicks that button one, it will run this particular code. You'll notice that in that event, there's this, or in this event handler, there's this argument called EventArgs. And you can think of that as the actual contents of the message. Remember, the event is coming in and is going to be handled by your handler. It needs to know, where did this come from? What, if it was a network event, how much was in the buffer? When did it come in? If this is a mouse event, it might be somewhere like where the mouse was clicked. So this event args thing contains the information of the details of that particular event message. And some event handlers, like an on-mouse click event, is going to use a derived class, an inherited class from EventArgs. So mouse EventArgs has more additional details specific to a mouse click event. They may have an X and Y coordinate, for example, that you may handle to deal with where the user actually clicked the mouse. So event-driven programming is fantastic. It's a great way of developing very sophisticated programs. The challenge, though, is that you have to find the right event to handle. And these frameworks are massive nowadays, and they do change and they evolve. And some things that were in vogue before are out of favor now. And so knowing which events to handle is really the trick to learning these sophisticated frameworks. The actual code you write inside the event handlers is to some extent pretty routine, and it's really just figuring out which event to handle and in which order uh, you want to handle them. So, for example, on a data bound item, there's a general syntax for like on data bound and versus on data binding. And so data bound being past tense means that the event has already occurred. On data binding means that it's starting to occur. So there's some language things that you'll pick up with the .NET framework that'll help you out tremendously. But those challenges are well worth it for the fact that these event-driven frameworks provide you with a whole lot of heavy lifting right out of the gate. So let's go take a look at code on how some of this might work. So let's jump over to Visual Studio here. And I've written a quick little event program that is going to handle a button click, basically. So here I'm using Windows Forms as an example. I've added a button to the Windows form, and I've added a panel. And one way I can create the handler for this particular button is to just double click it. If I double click the object, the most common event will be used to generate the handler. So in this case, it's a click event, and it belongs to button one. This is just a semantic thing. This is just a choice by Visual Studio to name it this particular way. I could name this anything I wanted and still have it be the button click event handler. But this just helps you remind yourself this is a click event handler for button one. So if I'm in this code, you can see I have written some real simple code here. Basically, it just checks to see what color the panel is and flips it between red and blue back and forth. And then it changes the button text so that that is put in proper context. Let's see how that runs real quick. So if I'm in here, if I click the button, I should run my event handler code. So clicking the button generates the event gets handled, so it turns the panel blue and sets this to red. So if I click again, it runs the same code again and it sets it to red. You can see it handles those particular events. The real power here is that if you're not handling the events, Windows is still handling the events. So I can do for example, Windows screen or .NET is still handling the events for me. I can do things like resize. I didn't have to write the code to do resizing. Now, of course, my code doesn't resize my panel, so I'm using the default resize here. But that shows you the power of these frameworks, is that they will handle a lot of stuff for you, and you get to focus on the details of what makes your program a unique experience. So Those are an example of .NET programming, but what I didn't show you is what would happen if I wanted to handle an event that is not the default. Well, here, let's say for the example, that resize event, I come back to my form, and with my form selected, I can come over to the lightning bolt icon, the events, and you can see that one of these events for this form would be, for example, resize. So I could assign a function here like do resize, or let's say that I wanted to do a scroll when this form gets scrolled. So I could do like form1 underscore on scroll. And you'll see that the development environment builds that application for me, and in this or event handler for me, and in this case, it uses a scroll event args argument. So now I'm going to get information in that E, things like where the scroll bar is positioned, whether it went up or down, etc. So building event-driven programs is fantastic, and it is a fairly common paradigm to a wide variety of development environments beyond just the .NET framework.